Revit has a very powerful rendering engine built right into the application, so let's take a look at how to use it. You would typically render your 3D views to accurately represent the materials, the sun and lighting, and any shadow effects that you'd like to see in a view, as well as to create photorealistic views that you'd like to share with the collaborators. Now you can render in the Revit application or in the cloud. We'll actually look at both ways. An important thing to keep in mind about renderings is that renderings are static snapshots of your data. When you render a view, it's no longer dynamically updating with changes to the model. It's a snapshot taken at the point of time when you did the rendering. Let's start by looking at how you would render an exterior view in Revit. I often start with exterior views because the lighting is very simple for the exterior views, typically just being based on the sun. You can open an exterior 3D view and then set the sun settings for this view. You'll want to choose a still study by the location, date, and time if you'd like to have an accurate rendering for a specific spot. You can open the Render tool. It appears under the View menu in the Presentation section. You'll find the Render tool there, or by clicking the Show Render Dialog control at the bottom of the drawing area. Either way works. Next, you can specify the rendering settings in the Rendering Setting dialog. You can specify the quality of the rendering that you'd like to use, anywhere from draft to medium to high, all the way up to best. And the impact of changing that quality is that you'll get a finer rendering. The image will look a little bit better, but it'll also take much longer to produce that rendering. Similarly, you can choose the resolution for the rendering you produce, whether you'd like to have a screen resolution or a printer resolution. For most of our work, I'll choose screen because I'll be viewing the images on the screen and I can work with that resolution. Additional resolution really won't help me. But you'll switch to the printer setting when you're going to be producing an image that will be printed out at a higher resolution. Again, the trade-off is that if you have a higher resolution, you'll be creating more data and that'll take more time to render. For the lighting scheme, since this is going to be an exterior rendering, I'm going to choose just the sun only to take advantage of the sun during the daytime. Then for the background, we can choose a solid color, or we can let Revit simulate a sky image, either cloudy or clear, depending upon what we'd like to have appear in our view. Another very powerful option is that we can actually choose an image, some sort of a photograph or an image that we'd like to have appear behind our model to help set up the context. After we've adjusted the rendering settings, we're ready to run that rendering process. And to do that, we just click the Render button. Now, we may need to wait a bit as the rendering engine completes several passes. The time required to produce the rendering really depends on the quality and the resolution settings that you've selected. Now, you can stop the rendering at any time. I'll typically do that if I find that either the rendering is showing something that I don't want to keep, then I'll need to go back and adjust some settings and then start the rendering over again, or if the image is already of a high enough quality that I can capture the work that's already been done and use that. If you do stop the rendering before the rendering is fully completed, the rendering will save all of your progress up to that point. So you'll see the finest image that was displayed up to that point in time. Now, after the rendering is completed, you may need to adjust the exposure a bit to fine-tune the lighting effects. We'll talk about that more when we look at the interior renderings. We can save that rendering to the project. That'll save that snapshot as part of our project file. Or we can choose to export the image. If we'd like to export it to our disk as a JPEG or a PNG or an image file format that we could use in another application. Next, let's look at how you render an interior view in Revit. And you'll find that the workflow is very similar to rendering an exterior view, the big difference being changes you need to make to account for lighting differences. So to render that interior view, start by opening the 3D view, and again, open the Render tool. Now in the Render Settings dialog, we'll again choose a quality for the rendering, anywhere from draft to medium to high to best, keeping in mind that the higher we set that quality, the longer it will take to produce that rendering. We'll also choose that resolution, whether it's going to be a screen rendering or we need to choose a higher resolution because the image will be printed out. The key choice in the Rendering Settings dialog when creating interior renderings is the lighting scheme. And you can choose Interior Sun Only, Interior Sun and Artificial, or Interior Artificial Only, depending upon the lighting sources you'd like to consider. Now you'll notice that each of those three lighting scheme choices that I'm recommending all start with the word interior versus exterior. And the reason for choosing an interior lighting scheme is that tells Revit to adjust the exposure settings for the rendering to match interior lighting conditions, which are typically much narrower than the exterior lighting conditions. If you leave things set to one of the exterior lighting schemes, your interior renderings turn out very dark because they're accounting for the fact that you might have very bright sunlight somewhere in the view. But for our interior renderings, we typically want to narrow that exposure range down quite a bit, so we choose one of the interior schemes instead. For interior views, you can again choose a background, either color, sky image, or a photographic image if you'd like to have something appear through the windows of your model. And if you're using artificial lights as one of your light sources for this rendering, be sure to click on the Artificial Lights button and adjust the individual lights, either turning them on and off or adapting their dimming levels as needed to create the effect that you'd like. Now we're ready to run the rendering process for the interior rendering, and to do that you can click the Render button, then wait as the rendering engine completes several passes. Again, the time required will depend on the quality and the resolution that you selected in the render settings. You can stop the rendering at any time, and your progress up to that point will be saved. And after the rendering is completed, you'll probably want to adjust the exposure settings, especially for these interior renderings. To adjust the image exposure on a view that you've rendered, return to the Rendering dialog and click the Adjust Exposure button. In the Exposure Control dialog that appears, you can fine-tune the different aspects of the exposure for your view. I tend to focus on the exposure value first, either brightening or darkening the overall image, but then you can go further and adjust either the highlights, those are the brightest spots on the image, or the shadows, and that's fine-tuning the darkest spots in the image. And usually a combination of those three values will actually create the effect that you'd like. Now, as an example, in the lower left-hand image, you'll find an overexposed image. It's a little bit too bright back in the corner, and I'd like to darken that a bit so I can see more of the detail in the rendered image. So to create that effect, what I'd probably do is darken the image first, just bringing down the overall lighting level for the entire image, and then I might go one step further, bringing down the highlights, making them just a little bit darker so they're not quite as bright and they're not burning so much. And then for the shadows, I might bring them to the lighter side, so the darkest areas aren't quite as dark. And the combination of those effects, and it usually takes a little bit of experimentation, can usually yield the desired visual effect for your rendered image. Okay, as you're working in this dialog, click the Apply button to see what the effect of the settings so far is on your image. And then when you're done, click the OK button to accept the exposure changes that you've made to this rendered image. Next, let's look at how you can render a nighttime view in Revit. And we'll follow a very similar workflow, focusing mostly on changes in the lighting scheme. Open an exterior or an interior 3D view, depending upon which you'd like to render. Then let's open the rendering settings and set the quality to either draft, medium, high, or best, and set the resolution, again, to screen or printer. Now for the lighting scheme, choose either interior or exterior, depending upon the type of view that you're rendering, and then choose either sun and artificial to look at a combination of the sun that would be available at the time of day you set and the artificial lighting, or choose artificial only if you'd only like to consider the light being cast by your artificial lighting sources. Now for the background of your nighttime rendering, you can choose a solid color or a sky image, but it'll probably be fairly dark because it's nighttime. Or in a very effective trick you may want to try is to use an image for the sky. So choose a nice starry image that can be the background for your rendering, and it'll create a very effective visual effect overall. Since it's nighttime and you will be using the artificial lighting as one of your primary light sources, be sure to pay attention to those artificial lights, turning them on and off as desired, and setting the dimming level to create the appropriate effect that you'd like to have in your rendered view. After rendering your nighttime view, you may find that you'll need to adjust the image exposure a bit to create just the desired lighting effect. Now, if your nighttime rendered view turns out very dark, as in the image at the upper right, don't necessarily go back and add more light to the view. You can often create the effect you want and bring much more light out in the view just by adjusting the exposure settings. So the difference between the two views shown at the right isn't that we've added more lights to the view or turned on more lights. It's just that we've changed the exposure settings to bring out more of the light that's already present in the view. To do that, return to the rendering settings and click the Adjust Exposure button to bring up the Exposure Control dialog, and then in that dialog again, slightly drag the values for the exposure value, the highlights, and the shadows to tweak and fine-tune each of those different aspects of the exposure. And when you're done and have the effect that you like, click OK, or cancel or reset, depending upon whether you'd like to save the changes that you've made.